Rain hammered the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists, blurring the empty highway into streaks of silver and shadow. It was 2 a.m., and David Carter was just trying to get home. The heater in his old Ford pickup wheezed against the cold, filling the cab with a thin breath of warmth. His hands, rough from years of turning wrenches, rested steady on the wheel. At 42, David lived life with the same patience he used in his work: slow, careful, deliberate. He knew rushing through anything, whether it was fixing an engine or making a decision, usually meant trouble. Tonight was supposed to be simple: close the shop, lock up, drive the long, quiet stretch to the little house on the edge of town, maybe warm up leftover stew and fall asleep to an old jazz record. That was the plan. But plans don't mean much when the world decides to throw you a curve. Through the curtain of rain, he saw her. At first, she was just a pale shape ahead, barely lit by the truck's headlights. Then the details came into focus, and they didn't make sense. A woman, barefoot, her long white dress heavy with rain clinging to her like it was trying to pull her down into the road. She moved like she'd been walking for hours, each step uncertain, but stubborn. David eased his foot off the gas. Instinct told him to keep driving. People on the highway at this hour dressed like that usually meant trouble, the kind you couldn't fix with a wrench. But something about the way she kept her head down, the way her shoulders shook under the weight of the storm, cut through his caution. He slowed, rolled down the passenger window just enough for his voice to reach her. "You all right, ma'am?" She stopped, turning toward the sound. Her face glistened under the rain, hair plastered to her cheeks. When she spoke, her voice was barely louder than the storm. "Please, help me." 2 words. That was all it took. David reached over, pushed the passenger door open. "Get in before you freeze." She hesitated, her eyes darting into the darkness behind her, like she expected someone to appear out of it. Then she climbed in, her soaked dress spilling across the seat. Water pooled instantly on the floor mat, but David didn't care. From behind the seat, he pulled an old wool blanket, worn thin but still warm. "Here," he said, draping it over her trembling shoulders. He twisted the cap off a dented thermos and poured steaming tea into the lid, handing it over carefully so it wouldn't spill. "Sip it slow, it's hot." For the first time she looked at him, really looked. There was fear in her eyes, but something else too. Relief, like she'd finally stopped running. "I'm David," he said simply. She hesitated again, her voice breaking as she answered, "Isabella." David nodded, putting the truck back in gear. He didn't ask questions yet. He didn't need to. Whatever had her walking barefoot down a highway in a wedding dress at 2 a.m. wasn't a story that could be told in one breath. All he knew was that this night, this strange rain-soaked night, had just changed the course of both their lives, and deep down, he felt it. Whatever was chasing her wasn't far behind. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle by the time David pulled off the highway, but the cab of the truck still felt thick with the damp scent of wet fabric and cold air. The old wipers squeaked with each pass, cutting a narrow strip of clarity through the windshield before the fog claimed it again. Isabella sat with the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, her hands curled around the empty thermos lid as if it were still warm. She hadn't said much since they left the highway. Every so often David caught her glancing at the side mirror, her eyes darting like she expected headlights to appear out of the darkness behind them. "You live around here?" David asked, keeping his tone light, like they were just passing time on an ordinary night. She shook her head without looking at him. "No, not anymore." The way she said it, like the words themselves carried weight, made David's grip tighten on the wheel. He didn't press her. People opened up when they were ready, and forcing it only made them close off deeper. He knew that from experience. At a red light, David reached over to adjust the heater vents toward her. That's when he saw it, thin, reddish marks circling her wrists, just peeking from under the sleeves of the dress. Not the kind you get from a fall or bump. These were the kind that come from someone holding on too tight for too long. Her eyes followed his glance, and she instinctively pulled the blanket closer, covering them. "Long night," he said instead, giving her an out. She gave a weak laugh that didn't sound like a laugh at all. "Longest one of my life." They drove in silence for a few minutes more, the hum of the engine and the occasional splash from the wet road filling the air between them. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low. "My wedding was tonight." David glanced at her, eyebrows raised, but said nothing. "I ran away. 3 hours before it ended." She gave a faint, bitter smile. "Guess I didn't make it to the honeymoon." He let the words settle, the weight of them hanging in the space between the seats. "That's a hell of a thing to run from," he said finally. Her lips pressed together, eyes fixed on the blur of passing streetlights. "You don't know him. You don't know what he's like when things don't go his way." David's mind flickered to memories he didn't ask for. Supervisors who smiled for the cameras but tightened their grip behind closed doors. Neighbors whose politeness turned cold the moment they thought you'd forgotten your place. He didn't need the details to understand the kind of man she was talking about. "Look," he said, pulling onto the quiet road toward his neighborhood, "I got a couch you can crash on for the night. Tomorrow, we'll figure something out. No strings." She turned to study him then, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to find the catch. Maybe she was used to offers that came with hidden prices. But all she saw was a tired man with grease still under his nails, offering her the simplest thing she hadn't had in a long time: safety without conditions. "Thank you," she whispered, and for the first time since she got in the truck, her shoulders eased, just a little. David didn't know her full story yet, but he knew this: whoever she was running from wouldn't stop easy, and if they came looking, they'd find her here, and him. David's house sat on the far edge of town where the streetlights thinned out and the air felt quieter, heavier. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and gleaming under the pale glow of the moon. His old pickup rattled into the gravel driveway, headlights sweeping across the side of the small, single-story home. It wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms, a worn front porch, and a garage packed with tools. But it was his. Every nail, every paint job, every small repair had been done by his own hands. After years of being told what he couldn't have, this place was proof of what patience and stubbornness could build. He killed the engine. For a moment they sat in the stillness, the ticking sound of the cooling motor filling the cab. Isabella clutched the blanket tighter. Her dress was still damp, and in the dim light, her skin looked almost translucent. "You all right?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then nodded. "I think so." David stepped out first, the crunch of gravel under his boots breaking the silence. He walked around to her side and opened the door. She accepted his hand as she climbed down, her bare feet touching the cold stones. "Careful," he said, guiding her toward the porch. Inside, the faint scent of motor oil and cedar hung in the air. The living room was small but clean, with a sturdy couch that had seen better days, a coffee table stacked with old car magazines, and a coat rack that leaned slightly to the left. "You can take the couch," David said, pulling a folded quilt from the linen closet. "Bathroom's down the hall, second door on the right. I'll grab you a towel and some dry clothes, probably not your style, but they'll be warm." She managed a small smile. "Anything's better than this." She glanced down at the heavy, mud-speckled wedding dress clinging to her legs. David disappeared into the bedroom and returned with an old hoodie and sweatpants, neatly folded. "You can change in the bathroom. I'll get some tea going." When she left the room, he stood in the quiet, listening to the faint creak of the bathroom door closing. A strange unease settled in his chest. He'd picked people up before, strangers stranded by a flat tire or bad weather, but this was different. She wasn't stranded. She was running. He poured water into the kettle and set it on the stove, his mind replaying the way she'd looked over her shoulder on the highway. That wasn't the glance of someone afraid of the dark. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what might be following. The bathroom door opened, and Isabella stepped out, her hair damp from a quick rinse, his hoodie hanging loose on her frame. She looked younger, almost unrecognizable from the rain-soaked figure he'd picked up. But her eyes, they were still watchful, still braced for something. He handed her the steaming mug. "Drink. You'll feel better." She took it with both hands, inhaling the warmth. "You didn't have to stop tonight," she said quietly. Most people wouldn't have. David leaned against the counter, meeting her gaze. Maybe. But most people don't like to see someone walking barefoot in a wedding dress at 2 in the morning either. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. It lasted only a second before fading. Outside, a distant engine roared down the road, low, powerful, and out of place in this part of town at this hour. David's head turned toward the sound, his body instinctively stilling. Isabella froze too. "Expecting someone?" he asked. She shook her head. The car passed by without slowing, its tail lights disappearing into the dark. But the knot in David's gut didn't ease. Something told him this wasn't the last strange noise he'd hear tonight. It was just past 9 in the morning when David's door swung open without so much as a knock. He was in the kitchen halfway through his first cup of coffee when the sound hit him, a sharp creak of the hinges followed by the heavy rhythm of footsteps crossing his floor. No hesitation, no apology. David stepped into the living room and saw them. 3 men, dark suits, polished shoes that didn't belong anywhere near his gravel driveway. They walked in like they'd been here before, like the place was theirs. The tallest one, broad shoulders, a face that looked like it had been chiseled from concrete, locked eyes with him and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind a man wears when he knows you're about to lose something important. "Morning," the man said, his voice deep, casual. "We're looking for the boss's bride." David didn't move. He didn't glance toward the hallway where he knew Isabella would be. He just stared at the man, his own voice steady. "No bride here." That earned him a smirk. The man pulled a phone from his pocket, tapped the screen, and then, without taking his eyes off David, hit the speaker button. A smooth, cold voice filled the room. "Mr. Carter, I hear you've been doing some late-night charity work. I'd like my property returned." David felt a heat rise in his chest, not from fear, but from the word property. He'd heard that tone before, from bosses who thought a paycheck bought your soul, from customers who assumed your skin color meant they could bargain you down to nothing. "She's not property," David said. A pause on the line, then a soft laugh. "You'll learn. Everything has a price, even your little shop." David stepped forward, closing the space between him and the tallest man. "If you lay a finger on her," he said, each word sharp and slow, "you'll regret it for the rest of your miserable life." Silence. Then the voice returned, colder now. "We'll see." The line went dead. The tallest man slipped the phone back into his pocket. "We'll be back," he said simply, as if he were promising to drop by for lunch. He gave a quick nod to the others, and just like that, they turned and walked out. No rush, no fear. The door closed behind them, but the air in the room felt heavier than before. From the hallway, Isabella appeared, her face pale, eyes wide. "They found me." David studied her for a long moment. She was trembling, not from the cold this time, but from the memory of a life she'd barely escaped. "I should go," she whispered, "before you get hurt." He shook his head. "You stay." His voice was firm, final. "And if your boss wants anything back, he's going to have to get past me first." Her eyes searched his, like she was trying to believe someone could mean it. What she didn't know, what those men in suits didn't know, was that David Carter had been here before. Different faces, different threats, same story. He'd learned that people with power always made the same mistake. They underestimated the ones they thought were beneath them. And underestimation was a dangerous thing to give a man who'd been planning for trouble his whole life. The first blow came less than 24 hours later. David pulled into the lot behind his shop Monday morning and froze. 2 police cruisers sat at the curb, their lights off but their presence loud enough to draw the attention of the few neighbors already up. One officer leaned against the hood, sipping coffee. The other stood beside a man in plain clothes, flipping through a clipboard. David recognized him. Detective Morrison, mid-50s, white, built like a man who'd spent more time in an office than on the street. "Mr. Carter," Morrison called as David stepped out of the truck, "we've got a warrant to search the premises." David's jaw tightened. "For what?" "Anonymous tip says you've been selling stolen parts out of this place." Morrison's tone made it sound like he didn't quite believe it himself, but he also wasn't about to ignore it. David unlocked the front door without argument. Fighting in the open would only play into whoever set this up. Inside, the officers fanned out, opening tool drawers, checking the shelves, even crawling under cars that were halfway through repair. He knew exactly whose fingerprints were on this. Richard Blackwood didn't need to raise his voice or show up in person to ruin a man. He had people for that. David stood by the front counter, hands in his pockets, watching the search like it was just another day at the shop. Morrison returned 20 minutes later, holding nothing but his clipboard. "Didn't find anything suspicious," the detective said, his voice carrying a hint of apology. "Sorry for the inconvenience." David gave him a tight nod. No harm done. But harm had been done, and he knew it. The point wasn't to find anything. It was to plant the seed of suspicion, to make people wonder. The second blow landed that afternoon. 3 regular customers called to cancel their appointments. Different excuses, same hollow tone. Something came up. "We'll reschedule." David could almost hear the script in their voices. The third blow followed on Tuesday. His landlord, Mr. Williams, an older man David had rented from for 5 years without a single problem, showed up with 2 strangers in tailored suits. "David, I hate to do this," Williams began, eyes darting anywhere but David's face. "I've had a very generous offer for the building. I'm going to need you out by the end of the month." One of the suited men stepped forward, handing David a card. Blackwood Properties. Williams mumbled something about double the market rate and not being able to turn it down before making a quick exit. David turned the business card over in his hand. So this was the game. Destroy his reputation, bleed his income, rip away his space. The pattern was too familiar. Corporations had been using the same tactics against small black business owners for decades. Richard Blackwood was just another player in a long line of predators who believed power was permanent. David tucked the card into his pocket and locked the shop early that day. Back home, he sat at his desk, opened a fresh notebook, and began to write. Dates, times, names, every detail. Because Richard thought he was hunting a simple mechanic who'd fold under pressure. But David Carter wasn't folding. He was documenting, calculating, waiting. And sooner or later, Richard would find out what it felt like to be on the wrong end of patience. The rain hadn't returned, but the air felt heavy, like the sky was holding its breath. David was bent over his workbench late Tuesday afternoon, tightening the bolts on a rebuilt alternator, when he heard the soft jingle of the front door. He looked up to see Isabella, her hair pulled back into a loose braid, carrying 2 paper coffee cups. "You've been here since sunrise," she said, setting one on the counter. "Figured you could use this." David wiped his hands on a rag and gave a small nod of thanks. She'd been showing up every day since that first night, never asking for money, just quietly helping where she could, sorting invoices, organizing tools, keeping the place in order. But today, something in her face was different. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You okay?" he asked. She hesitated, her fingers curling around the cup. "David, maybe I should leave." He leaned against the counter, studying her. "Why?" "I don't want to be the reason you lose this place. He's already coming after you." "I know how far Richard will go." David took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth steady him before he answered. "You think running will stop him? That man doesn't stop because someone's out of sight. He stops when someone stands up to him." She didn't reply, but she didn't leave either. Instead, she lowered herself into the chair across from him. "You want to know what he's like?" she asked quietly. David set his cup down. "I want to know whatever you're ready to tell me." For a moment, her gaze drifted to the grimy workshop window. The afternoon light caught the edges of her face, making her look far older than her years. Not in wrinkles, but in the weight she carried. "When we met, I thought he was generous. He paid my bills, my rent, bought me a car. I thought it was love, but it wasn't generosity. It was investment. Every gift came with an interest ratus, and the debt was obedience. I didn't see it at first. I just thought I was lucky." Her hands tightened around the coffee cup, the cardboard crumpling slightly. "It started small, little comments about my friends, what I wore, where I went. Then it became rules. No male coworkers, no social media without his approval. He said it was to protect me. What it really did was isolate me. David listened without interrupting. He knew the rhythm of this kind of control, the slow boil, the way a person could wake up one day and realize they were standing in a cage they never saw being built. But what really scared me, she continued, her voice thinning, was how he treated people he thought were beneath him. Waiters, clerks, employees, anyone who couldn't give him something. He talked about them like they were tools, replaceable, manageable. She looked directly at David then, her eyes holding his. That's how he talks about you. Like you're a problem to be solved, not a person. David's jaw flexed, but he kept his voice calm. Then he's going to learn what happens when a problem fights back. A faint spark lit in her expression. Not quite hope, but the first sign of something close. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of a ceiling fan filling the air. Outside, the sound of a passing truck faded into the distance. Isabella glanced toward the door, then back to him. If you're serious about standing up to him, I have something you should see. And in that moment, David knew, whatever she was about to show him might change the shape of this fight completely. It was Wednesday morning when David heard the deep purr of an expensive engine roll up outside the shop. He straightened from the hood of a Chevy, his hands still smudged with grease, and looked toward the front. The sound was smooth, too smooth. German engineering, tuned to perfection. It stopped with the kind of precision that only comes from someone who's used to being chauffeured or owning the road. The door swung open and in walked Richard Blackwood. David had seen his type before. Tall, perfectly tailored suit, shoes polished to a mirror shine, hair styled like he'd stepped straight out of an advertisement. But it wasn't the clothes that made the impression. It was the air around him, the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been told no in his life. Richard didn't look at the shop like a customer would. He looked at it the way a developer looks at a condemned building, calculating the day it will be torn down. So, Richard said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge of disdain, you're the brave mechanic. He didn't offer his hand. David didn't step forward. And you're the man who thinks people are property. A faint smirk tugged at Richard's mouth, but his eyes stayed cold. Isabella, darling, he called over David's shoulder. You've played around long enough. It's time to go home. From the office, Isabella appeared, but she didn't move toward him. She came to stand beside David, her chin high despite the fear in her eyes. This is my home now, she said. Richard's smirk broke into a laugh. Don't be ridiculous. Look at this place. He waved a hand at the concrete floor, the oil stains, the open tool drawers. You were born for mansions, not this. And you were born to own people, David cut in, his voice flat. That got Richard's attention. He turned fully to face him now, studying him like a scientist examining an insect. You really believe you can take me on? I destroy companies before breakfast. A little workshop on the edge of town isn't even a warm-up. David didn't flinch. Maybe you should try fixing something for once. You might find it harder to break what you didn't build. Richard's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of something else, annoyance, maybe even uncertainty. Careful, Mr. Carter, he said quietly. Men who get in my way tend to regret it. David reached into his back pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen. Funny thing about threats, he said. They sound a lot different when they're recorded. Richard's eyes narrowed. David slipped the phone back into his pocket. Now you can leave, or you can keep talking for the record. Your choice. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the silence between them charged and dangerous. Then Richard turned, the movement sharp, and strode out without another word. The sound of his car starting was almost too smooth, too calm, as if he was making sure David knew he wasn't done. When the taillights disappeared, Isabella let out the breath she'd been holding. You shouldn't have pushed him like that. David shook his head. He was going to push anyway. Better he knows I don't break easy. What he didn't tell her was that every word, every threat, every glance had been part of a file he'd been quietly building, and Richard Blackwood had just given him another piece of ammunition. By Thursday morning, David had turned the back wall of his office into something that looked less like a mechanic's space and more like a detective's war room. A big whiteboard leaned against the wall, the kind he'd picked up at a yard sale years ago and never used, until now. In thick black marker, he'd drawn 4 boxes connected by arrows: reputation, income, location, fear. Under each, he'd listed the blows Richard had already landed: anonymous police search, canceled client jobs, landlord eviction notice, unannounced visits from the suits. David stood there, coffee in one hand, marker in the other, and studied it like it was an engine diagram. He knew patterns. Every machine had one, and Richard was a machine of intimidation, methodical, precise, and arrogant enough to believe no one could see the moving parts. But David saw them. He'd grown up seeing them. The shop door creaked open, and Isabella stepped in, carrying a stack of neatly organized invoices. She stopped when she saw the board. "What's all this?" she asked. David capped the marker and took a sip of coffee. "How your ex works. He's running the same playbook I've watched corporations use on small black business owners my whole life. First, they ruin your name. Then they choke your money. Then they take your space. Finally, they wait for you to fold from fear. And you think mapping it out helps?" He nodded. "If I can see his pattern, I can get ahead of it." She studied him for a moment. "So what's next?" David hesitated. He'd been thinking about that since the day the suits first showed up. He could keep playing defense, or he could change the field entirely. That afternoon, the decision came in the form of a phone call. "This is Marcus Washington, Internal Revenue Service Investigation Division," the voice said, deep and measured. "Mr. Carter, I'd like to speak with you about your business records." David leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Washington's tone wasn't hostile. It was curious. When the investigator arrived an hour later, David recognized something in him immediately. A man who had seen a lot of corruption and wasn't impressed by money or titles. Washington was in his 50s, a black man with a calm presence and sharp eyes that took in everything. "I'll need to review your accounting books for the last 3 years," Washington said. David handed them over without hesitation. "You'll find them cleaner than my floor," he said. Washington chuckled softly, flipping through the files. "You know, this is the 3rd time this month I've been called to look into a small black-owned business over anonymous tax evasion tips, all from the same law firm." David raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, Blackwood Associates?" Washington's eyes met his. "You've done your homework." David didn't answer. He didn't need to. By the time Washington left, David had added a new arrow to his board, one that pointed in the opposite direction. He wasn't just mapping Richard's moves anymore. He was building his own. And for the first time since this all began, David felt the ground start to shift, just a little, under Richard Blackwood's feet. The shop was quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that settles after the last customer leaves and the tools are back in their places. Outside, the sky had darkened into a deep indigo, the first few stars peeking through. David was at his workbench, hands busy sorting sockets back into their trays when Isabella appeared in the doorway. There was something in her posture, shoulders drawn in, hands clasped tight, that made him set the tools down. "I need to show you something," she said. David leaned against the bench. "Go ahead." She glanced toward the front windows, then shut the office door behind her. From the pocket of his old hoodie, the one she'd been wearing since that first night, she pulled out a slim smartphone. The case was cracked, and the screen had a faint spiderweb fracture in the corner. "I've been holding on to this for over a year," she said. "I didn't tell you because once you see it, there's no going back." She swiped the screen to life, tapped through the gallery, and handed it to him. The first photo was grainy, taken from waist height, but clear enough to show Richard sitting in a dimly lit restaurant, sliding a thick envelope across the table to a man in a city council badge. David flicked to the next one. This time, a shot of a document spread open on a desk, a building permit approval form dated 2 weeks before it was officially logged by the city. The signature line bore the same councilman's name. One after another, the images told a story. Fraudulent contracts with inflated figures, spreadsheets of consulting fees that were anything but, text messages discussing pressure tactics to push small property owners into selling. Photos of meetings in back rooms, of cash in unmarked envelopes, of faces David recognized from the local news shaking hands with Richard. Jesus, he muttered, flipping through them. I took every one of those while we were together, Isabella said. At first I thought I was being clever, keeping them in case I needed leverage. Then I realized I was scared for my life. If he ever found out, he wouldn't just take my phone. He'd make sure I disappeared. David looked up at her. And you've kept this all this time? She nodded. Hidden folders, backups, a burner email account he never knew about. Her voice wavered, but her eyes stayed locked on his. I wasn't just running from a man, David. I was running from a criminal operation. He handed the phone back to her, his mind already turning. This wasn't just personal anymore. This was evidence, enough to tear apart Richard's entire foundation if handled right. Does anyone else know you have this? He asked. No one, she said. Not until now. David drew in a slow breath. Then we're going to make sure it doesn't just stay in your phone. We're going to put it in the right hands. She gave a shaky laugh. And whose hands are the right hands? He thought of a name he hadn't said in years, an old friend who had a knack for making sure the truth saw daylight. Someone I went to school with. Tomas Rivera, investigative journalist. If there's anyone who can turn this into something Richard can't bury, it's him. For the first time since she'd walked into the shop that night, Isabella's expression shifted from fear to something sharper, resolve. And as David picked up his phone to make the call, he realized that the quiet war Richard had started had just taken a turn he'd never see coming. The next evening, the shop was dark except for the glow from David's small office lamp. He sat at the desk, phone pressed to his ear, the low hum of the fridge in the corner, the only other sound. On the third ring, a familiar voice answered, warm and slightly amused. David Carter, I can't believe it. How many years has it been? 12, David said, and I wouldn't be calling this late unless it was something big. Tomas Rivera chuckled, but there was an alertness under the humor. Go on. I've got photos, documents, enough to put a hole clean through Richard Blackwood's empire. And they're legit, time-stamped, backed up, verified by the woman who took them. You interested? The line went silent for a beat. Then Rivera's tone dropped into the professional mode David remembered from their college days. Where are you right now? Shop. Too obvious. Meet me tomorrow night. Downtown. That cafe across from the old Tribune building. You remember it? David smiled faintly. Still makes the best coffee in the city. Bring everything you've got, and David, be careful. If you're holding what I think you're holding, you're not the only one looking for it. The next night, the cafe's warm light spilled out onto the wet sidewalk. David arrived early, a plain folder tucked under his arm. He sat near the back, his eyes on the door. Rivera walked in 10 minutes later, dressed in a worn leather jacket, his dark hair flecked with early gray. He slid into the booth across from David without ceremony. All right, Rivera said, leaning forward. Show me. David laid the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were printed copies of the most incriminating photos, Richard passing envelopes to officials, contracts signed before legal approval, lists of expedited payments to zoning boards. Rivera flipped through them slowly, his eyes sharpening with each page. My God, he muttered. We've been chasing rumors about this for years, but without hard proof, it's all smoke. This... He tapped the page, showing a handshake over a briefcase stuffed with cash. This is dynamite. That's only part of it, David said. The rest is on a drive. Multiple backups. I'm not letting it sit in one place. Rivera closed the folder and sat back. If I can cross-reference this with the building permit violations we've already been tracking, I can make this airtight. But you need to understand, once we move, there's no putting the lid back on. He will know exactly who came for him. David didn't blink. He already knows. He's been trying to crush me for a week. Rivera studied him, then nodded. All right, give me 7 days. I'll start connecting the dots tonight. When the story runs, it won't just hit him, it'll bring the whole network down. As they stood to leave, Rivera's voice dropped low. David, watch yourself. Men like Richard, when they're cornered, they don't think about winning anymore. They think about taking everyone else down with them. David stepped out into the cool night, the folder now in Rivera's hands. For the first time since this started, he felt the faint stir of something that almost felt like hope. But he also knew Richard Blackwood wouldn't take this quietly. And the next move was his. The letter was waiting for him on the shop's front door Monday morning, taped at eye level in a thick cream envelope with his name typed in bold. David peeled it off and stepped inside before opening it. The paper inside was heavy, expensive, legal stationery. His eyes skimmed the first lines, and a slow, humorless smile spread across his face. Plaintiff, Richard Blackwood. Defendant, David Carter. Cause, interference in contractual relationship and alienation of affection. Damages sought, $200,000. He read it twice, then tossed it onto the counter. Isabella came in from the back, wiping her hands on a rag. "What's that?" David gestured at the document. "Your ex just accused me of seducing you to hurt his business." Her jaw dropped. "That's insane." "Of course it is," David said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "But it's also his first real mistake." She frowned. "How is being sued for $200,000 a mistake?" David picked up the papers again, tapping the top with one finger. "Because once you file a lawsuit, both sides get discovery rights. That means I can request his financial records, all of them. Every transaction, every offshore transfer, every shell company payment. If he refuses, the court compels him. If he lies, it's perjury." Realization flickered in her eyes. "You're going to use his own lawsuit to get more evidence." David sipped his coffee. "Exactly. He thinks this is about intimidation. What it really is an open door into his vault." Isabella leaned on the counter, her voice still tight. "He's not going to see it that way until it's too late." David smiled faintly. "That's the point." By noon, he was at his desk drafting a preservation of evidence notice and a list of document requests that would make any corporate attorney sweat. Construction contracts, property acquisitions, political contributions, corporate tax filings going back a decade. He copied Rivera on the email. The journalist called within minutes. "You're asking for his offshore accounts." "That's where the bodies are buried," David said. Rivera gave a low whistle. "If this works, we're not just running a story. We're running a headline that'll be taught in journalism schools." By the time the sun set, David had also placed a call to Marcus Washington. When the IRS investigator picked up, David didn't waste time. "You told me men like Blackwood don't stop. Well, he just handed me a legal excuse to dig into his finances. You interested in what I find?" Washington's voice sharpened. "Bring me everything. If you can tie this to federal tax evasion or laundering, we can skip straight past local politics and go to federal prosecution." David hung up and sat back in his chair. The shop was quiet, the kind of quiet he liked, the kind where you could hear yourself think. Richard believed this lawsuit was the start of David's collapse, but David knew better. It was the beginning of the end, for Richard. It was late Wednesday morning when David heard the low, guttural growl of an engine pull up outside. This wasn't the smooth purr of Richard's luxury sedan. This was something heavier, meaner. He was under the hood of a customer's Ford when the shop door banged open hard enough to rattle the glass. David straightened, rag in hand, and saw them. Two men stepped in first, bigger than the suits from before, the kind of build you get from years of doing damage, not from gym memberships. They wore plain jeans and heavy jackets, the kind that could hide a weapon. Behind them came Richard. No smile this time, no suit either, just a black turtleneck and an expression carved from stone. The air in the shop seemed to shrink. Richard didn't waste words. "You've got 48 hours. If Isabella isn't in my office by Thursday morning, you're going to find out that accidents happen all the time in the suburbs." David stayed leaning over the engine, wiping his hands slowly. His voice was calm when he answered. "I understand the threat perfectly. Thanks for being so clear." Richard's jaw tightened. "You don't understand who you're messing with, mechanic. I ruin people like you before breakfast." David finally straightened, closing the hood with a solid, deliberate click. "I'm sure you do. By the way, how did your meeting with the federal prosecutors go yesterday?" For the first time, Richard blinked, just a flicker, but David caught it. "What are you talking about?" Richard asked, his tone a shade sharper. "Agent Washington works fast," David said, stepping closer, "especially when he's got photographic evidence of bribery and money laundering." Richard gave a short, humorless laugh. "You're bluffing." David reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With one swipe, the screen lit up. There, in full color, was a photo of Richard passing an envelope to Councilman Morris, on in a dim back room. "Isabella documented everything for 2 years," David said. "Every bribe, every threat, every scheme you thought no one would ever see." Richard's smirk wavered. His phone rang. He ignored it. Then it rang again, the sound cutting through the tension. This time he answered. "Mr. Blackwood?" A voice on the other end spoke fast, too far away for David to catch the words. But he saw the change in Richard's face, his eyes narrowing, the color draining just slightly. "What do you mean, frozen accounts? Since when?" Richard barked into the phone. David smiled faintly. Agent Washington was very specific about the timing. Richard ended the call abruptly, his breathing heavier now. The bigger of the two men shifted uneasily, as if unsure whether to keep standing by their boss or start inching toward the exit. Isabella's voice came from the office doorway, steady and clear. "You controlled what I saw, Richard. You didn't control what I kept." Richard turned toward her, and for the first time, David saw something new in his eyes. Not arrogance, not even rage. Fear. David stepped between them, phone still in hand. "Careful, Richard. Threatening a federal witness? That's a separate charge. And just so you know, this whole conversation has been recorded since you walked in." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the hum of the shop lights overhead. Richard didn't say another word. He turned and walked out, his muscle following close behind. The sound of the car starting was louder than it needed to be, like he wanted to leave a mark. But David knew this time Richard wasn't the one in control. He was starting to slip. By Thursday morning, the shift was undeniable. David didn't need to look at his whiteboard to know the pattern was breaking. He could hear it in the way Richard's world was starting to rattle apart. The first sign came at 9:12 a.m. when David was tightening a serpentine belt and caught the faint hum of a car idling outside. He wiped his hands, stepped to the shop door, and saw a black SUV parked across the street. The driver wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Surveillance, not the kind Richard paid for, the kind you couldn't buy off. At 10:27, David's phone buzzed with a text from Rivera. City Zoning Board just canceled 2 Blackwood projects, no explanation given. By noon, the pattern had turned into a drumbeat. Rivera called this time, his voice tight but energized. "Your guy's getting iced out. One of my sources says a council member refused to take his calls this morning. Guess who?" David didn't have to guess. "Morrison." "Bingo," Rivera said. "Looks like your photo made it to the right inbox." While they talked, David noticed Isabella at the office desk scrolling through her own phone. Her lips twitched into the faintest smirk before she looked up. Richard's car dealership just lost its financing partner. Someone leaked internal audits and they're ugly. David nodded slowly. The walls were starting to close, not on him, but on Richard. At 1:15 p.m., another call came in, this one from a number David didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was all clipped professionalism. "Mr. Carter, this is Agent Washington. Just wanted to inform you that several of Mr. Blackwood's accounts have been frozen pending review. Also, his construction firm's federal contracts have been suspended effective immediately." David couldn't help the small, satisfied exhale. That was fast. "We work quickly when the evidence is clean," Washington said. "And Mr. Cartes, you've done an exceptional job keeping it clean." By late afternoon, the shop's phone rang again. David let it go to voicemail, but the transcript popped up on his screen, a frantic message from one of Richard's longtime partners. "Call me back, Rich. We can fix this. Just call me back." David read it twice, then slid the phone into his pocket. Richard wasn't just losing assets now. He was losing allies. At 5:42, as the sun dipped low, David stepped outside to lock up. Across the street, the black SUV was gone. In its place, a silver sedan pulled to the curb, and two men in plain suits got out. Not muscle, not intimidation. Federal agents. They didn't even glance at David as they walked past. They were here for someone else. Inside, Isabella was already packing away the day's paperwork. "Something's happening," she said. David gave her a steady look. "It's called gravity. When you build everything on lies, eventually it all comes down." But even as he said it, he knew the fall wasn't over yet, and men like Richard Blackwood didn't hit the ground quietly. It happened the next morning, Friday, just after 10. David was under the lift, tightening the exhaust bracket on a Honda when the shop door slammed so hard it rattled the glass in its frame. He slid out on the creeper and saw them, the same two heavy-set men from before, only this time their shoulders were squared like they were expecting trouble, and behind them came Richard. He looked different. The crisp control was gone, replaced by a raw, simmering rage that made the air feel tight. His hair was slightly out of place, his shirt wrinkled, small details, but for a man like Richard, they were cracks in the mask. "You think you've won something?" he said, his voice louder than it needed to be. "You think you've beaten me?" David climbed to his feet slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "I think you're running out of people to scare." Richard stepped forward, closing the space between them until they were barely 2 feet apart. His eyes were bloodshot, the kind you get from a night without sleep and too much whiskey. "I built this city, Carter. I made the deals, greased the right palms. You don't get to walk in and undo it because you've got some pictures and a friend with a typewriter." David's tone didn't change. "Funny. The IRS and the Fed seem to think I do." Richard's nostrils flared. "You're nothing. You fix cars for a living. I own everything you see out there." David tilted his head. "You owned it, past tense." Something in that word, owned, hit Richard like a slap. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. "You keep pushing me and I swear You'll what?" David cut in, eyes locked on his. "Threaten me in front of witnesses again? That'll go over great in court." One of the heavy-set men shifted uneasily. They could feel it, the balance tipping. Richard's face twisted, and in that moment, David saw it. The moment the mask completely slipped. This wasn't the calculating mogul anymore. This was a desperate man cornered, swinging at shadows. "You're done," Richard spat. "You and that little runaway, you're both done. I'll make sure no one even remembers your name in 6 months." David stepped closer, close enough to see the flicker of uncertainty in Richard's eyes. "You just made your biggest mistake." Richard's jaw clenched. "And what's that?" David tapped his phone, which had been recording since the second the door slammed. "Physically threatening a federal witness. That's a whole new set of charges, and you just handed them to me gift-wrapped." For the first time, Richard's mouth opened without a comeback. The room seemed to press in on him, the weight of everything he'd lost finally starting to register. In the doorway, Isabella appeared, calm and steady. "You don't own me anymore, Richard, and you never will." The words landed heavier than anything David had said. Richard looked at her, then at David, and for a split second the fight drained out of him. Not because he accepted defeat, but because he was finally starting to see it coming. He turned sharply and stormed out, his men trailing behind. The sound of the car engine faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt different than before, not tense, but expectant. David exhaled slowly, the rag still in his hand. "He's breaking," he said. Isabella's eyes were steady. "Then let's finish it." By Monday morning, the first crack had turned into a landslide. David stood at the counter in his shop with a mug of coffee, watching the pieces fall in real time. The radio on the shelf behind him was tuned to the local news, and every few minutes Richard's name came up, each mention heavier than the last. "Breaking news, city officials have confirmed the suspension of all municipal contracts involving Blackwood properties. Federal agents are said to be reviewing records for potential charges related to bribery and money laundering." The words rolled out like gears clicking into place. David's phone buzzed with a message from Rivera. "Check page 1 of tomorrow's edition." Attached was a photo of the front page layout. Richard Blackwood, caught mid-handshake with Councilman Morrison, an unmarked envelope between them. It wasn't just the photo. Rivera's article was surgical. Names, dates, amounts, a network of shell companies stretching across 3 states. It all came from the evidence Isabella had risked everything to keep, backed by David's meticulous notes and Washington's federal reach. But halfway through the article, David hit the part that made his stomach clench. Rivera had found something new, something David hadn't known. The anonymous tip that cost David his old job at the town's biggest repair shop years ago, the one that claimed he'd stolen tools from the company, it traced back to a private investigator hired by a Blackwood subcontractor, part of a push to clear out undesirable employees and take over the shop's client list. Richard had been in his life long before Isabella ever set foot on that highway. David just hadn't known his name. He set the paper down, jaw tight. It wasn't just about protecting Isabella anymore. This was about finishing something that had started years ago. Isabella came in from the office holding her phone. "You need to hear this," she said and hit speaker. A voice crackled over the line, Washington's. "We just found something interesting in the corporate filings. On paper, Isabella, you're listed as a beneficial owner for 3 of Blackwood's shell companies. My guess is he used your name to hide funds offshore. That makes you the legal key to freezing and seizing those assets." David's eyebrows rose. So by running away, she accidentally took the keys to his vault with her. Washington's voice carried the faintest hint of a smile. Accident or not, it's poetic justice. His own trick just became the nail in his coffin. Isabella leaned against the counter, the weight of it hitting her. "All that time I thought he wanted me for control. Turns out he wanted me for cover." David put a hand on her shoulder. Either way, now he's got nothing left to hide behind. By late afternoon, the calls were coming faster than he could read them. Richard's business partners were cutting ties. His lawyers were threatening to quit over ethical conflicts, bank accounts frozen, properties under seizure orders. The man who walked into David's shop days ago with a smirk was being dismantled piece by piece, and the best part was he'd done half the work himself, underestimating the very people who brought him down. Outside, the sky had turned gold with the setting sun. David stood in the doorway, coffee in hand, watching the light spill across the street. Isabella came to stand beside him. "He's going to fight until the last minute," she said. David nodded. "Let him. The harder he thrashes, the faster he drowns." And somewhere across town, in an office stripped of its power, Richard Blackwood was finally realizing that for the first time in his life, he couldn't buy his way out. The morning Richard Blackwood was arrested, the sky over town was sharp and clear, the kind of winter blue that made the air feel thinner. David heard about it before he saw it. His phone buzzed with a text from Rivera. "Turn on the TV, Channel 4, now." He crossed the shop, grabbed the remote from the counter, and clicked it on. There he was. Richard stepping out of his glass-fronted office building, flanked by 2 federal agents in dark jackets. His wrists were locked in handcuffs, but he still tried to hold his chin high. Cameras flashed in rapid bursts, reporters shouted questions, microphones were thrust toward him. "Mr. Blackwood, are you guilty of these charges? Did you bribe public officials? Were you hiding assets offshore under your fiancé's name?" He didn't answer. His jaw was tight, and for the first time, his eyes darted, not in control anymore, but scanning for escape that wasn't there. The agents guided him toward a waiting black SUV, their grip firm, unshakable. Isabella came out of the office, wiping her hands on a rag, and froze when she saw the screen. Her breath caught, but she didn't say anything. She just stood there watching as the man who'd once dictated her every move was pushed into the back of a government vehicle. The anchor's voice cut through the image. Richard Blackwood faces multiple federal charges, including bribery, money laundering, racketeering, and witness intimidation. If convicted, he could serve decades in prison. David muted the TV. "It's done," he said. Isabella's eyes stayed on the screen for a moment longer, then she turned toward him. "No, it's starting. Now I get to live my life without looking over my shoulder." 6 months later, life looked very different. The shop had a fresh coat of paint and a brand new sign, Carter Reyes Automotive. Business had doubled, partly from the attention of Rivera's article. partly from the loyalty of a community that had watched them stand their ground. They'd hired 2 more mechanics, one of them a young kid David had been mentoring since high school. On the day of the ribbon cutting for their second location across town, the parking lot was full. Rivera was there with his camera crew, Washington in a crisp suit, even Detective Morrison, the man who once served the bogus warrant, came to shake David's hand. "You proved something we needed to see," Morrison said quietly. "That dignity isn't about money, it's about refusing to be bought." After the speeches, David and Isabella slipped away to the quiet of the new office. She stood at the window looking out at the crowd laughing and talking in the sun. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. "Every day," David said. "Do you regret stopping?" He smiled, the same steady smile he'd had that rain-soaked night when he pulled over. "Never. Some roads look like trouble when you turn onto them. Turns out they lead exactly where you're supposed to be." Down the street, the sound of cars and voices carried in through the open window. Life went on. But for David and Isabella, it wasn't just life, it was freedom. Richard Blackwood, stripped of everything he'd built on lies, now sat in a federal prison serving a 12-year sentence. His name was Mud in the city he once claimed to own. David had built something stronger than revenge. He'd built a life that no one could take from him. And as he stood beside Isabella watching the sunlight catch the new sign over their door, he knew that was